with that, I'm going to introduce our president, Erin Waters. She's going to bring her panel up, and you're going to introduce your panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Waters, president of RealClearPolitics. In my session, we're going to dig in a little bit about the examples, how the future of industry is looking, how the policy prohibits or helps it along, and some examples from the local community. So I'd like to invite my panelists up to the stage, please. Great. To my right, I have Robert Atkinson, the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. To his right is Diane Katz, senior research fellow at the Institute of Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. To her right, Steven Rosenbush, or just Steve. Steve, editor at the CIO Journal with the Wall Street Journal. And then lastly, Mark Jamison, a professor at University of Florida, and he is a visiting fellow at AEI. Thank you all for being here. We touched on this briefly in the earlier discussions, but what we want to talk about is traditional industry has changed. Technology has advanced and moved it along. We want to make some predictions about the future, what we think that holds for these industries, who's benefited, who's been hindered, and then the policies that might help it along. I'd like to start with Mark. Give us kind of the broad overview. Walk us through technology and how it has revolutionized industry or telecommunications specifically, which you know, and do it quickly decade by decade.
Okay, so sure.
Easy one.
Yeah. Well, I identify 4 or 5 kind of different things that are kind of milestones along the way. I go clear back to about 1970. That's when cellular technology was first made commercially viable. We didn't get it used in the United States for over another decade, but that was a game changer for the world and what was going to happen in telecommunications. Then I roll the clock forward again to about 1981, 82. That's when the IBM PC came out. That changed how people were going to use computing. There was the Apple II before that, but it was the IBM PC that really made the change. Then you go to 1993. That's when Mosaic came out. Mosaic took the internet from something that was nice for using email, maybe some file transfers, to something that changed people's lives. Each of these along the ways were not so much creating a new technology, but making the technology something that changed people's lives. The last one would have been the iPhone, iPod, 1981, 1987, I believe, excuse me, I got that wrong. 2001, 2007. Each one of these is taking about 10 to 15 years. So we're ripe for something else. Again, it's not going to be a new technology that knocks people's socks off, but someone taking things like what we're seeing with blockchain, artificial intelligence, et cetera, and putting those into people's hands in a ways that no one has imagined and changing people's lives again.
Excellent. I should say, we have our viewership. We're live streaming this event, and we usually see about 10,000 people that tune into it. So we're a much larger group than who's in the room. So some of the questions I might ask you to kind of explain down the road for those that are elsewhere in the country. Robert, what are your thoughts on what Mark had to say, and can you talk a little bit about your take on it?
Yeah, no, I agree with Mark that technology tends to go in these phases, or 10-year periods, let's say. And I think we are poised for another phase. I've termed that phase the CAS phase, CIS. I think there's 3 big things happening in technology now. One is connectivity. Just things are going to be connected that we could never connect before. We're going to connect billions and billions of devices from the soil sensors in a farmer's field to we'll be wearing wearable devices that sensors. The second is autonomy or automation. I put those together. We're going to have autonomous systems. We're going to have trains that are going to be running on their own or with a lot fewer people. We're obviously autonomous trucks. But automation, that's I think, a really big thing. We're going to have robotic technology get a lot better. And the third, and it all relates, all together, is smart systems or intelligent systems, largely through AI, and that's going to embed. Now, I think what's different about today and in the past, my colleague David Moschella at Leading Edge Forum has a good analogy where he says that the tech industry historically has been arms merchants. So you can go to an Oracle or an IBM or whatever, and you can buy what you need to build your company and do better. And you're going to use that tech. Now he's saying the technology industry is an invading army. So if you look at Silicon Valley, many, many firms in Silicon Valley are going, their business models are not about to give you a better database. They're about going in and disrupting your industry. So they're disrupting healthcare, transportation, logistics, financial services, education, you name it. So I think that's really the interesting thing, and I think it's going to happen in one of three ways. Either it'll be the big companies like Google's doing autonomous vehicles, it'll be small new companies that come out. Uber would be a good example of that 10 years ago. Or it will be incumbent companies that figure out that if they don't respond and transform their own businesses, that in Clay Christensen's terms, somebody else is going to do it for them.
Absolutely. Steven, as the editor of the CIO Journal, you've had the opportunity to cover growth and evolution in key industries that have been reindustrialization that is happening across the country due to technology. We talked a little bit about what those different industries have been. Can you walk us through a bit of that and what you've seen and what that ties into the predictions for the future?
Sure. What we've been reporting on for the last 7 years feels like an increasingly significant change in business, and I think that we're seeing the transfer of technology, certainly from the tech sector in Silicon Valley into almost every other industry or business in the economy. But at the same time, along with that technology, there's a lot of change in process and business model that goes along with it. So companies are changing the way that they do business, and above and beyond everything else, there's an enormous amount of cost that's being ripped out of many, many businesses. And there are a lot of new things happening, and it's extremely volatile.
Diane, you have done some work on energy specifically. We talked about kind of the policy shaping it. What have you seen in your work, and what do you see that affecting the future?
Well, if I may,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to pick up on a couple things that some of the other panelists had said. In terms of I cover regulation largely, and your comment about AT&T and us not getting the technology for another 10 years, as well as the invading army content, really connect into the regulatory policy debate, because on the one hand, we were delayed in getting cellular technology in large part because AT&T had a sanctioned monopoly by the government, and the competitive field was really dampened. And then in terms of the invading army, what we know about regulation is that it always benefits the incumbents, and so the biggest companies are going to have the abilities to come in and raid other companies because they have the resources to do so. I mentioned to Erin, energy, because that's one area where there's been a lot of implementation of different technology, in particular in energy efficiency and so on. And it's a good case study in how regulation can drive innovation and technology, because so much was committed to one goal, which was to reduce carbon emissions. And there is a lot to look at there in terms of what hasn't been done and what has, because regulation skews investment decisions, it drives specific types of technology to the detriment of other types of technology, and it also produces a lot of unintended consequences. So, for example, there's lots of incidents of biofuel or corn-based ethanol or solar panels, unintended consequences, negative effects on the environment. So basically, I'm here, all of which is to say, I'm here just to bring some attention to, how government is allowed to interfere with technological development. Because what we really do know is that standardization, which is essentially what regulation is in many ways, is an enemy of innovation. And so if we want to get certain things done through public policy, we should be looking at optimum ways that downplay regulation for other methods.
We talked a bit about, and this ties into a little what you said, but Mark, in the prior session, they talked a bit about the entrepreneurial spirit
Yeah.
And we've chatted about that as well. Can you talk about the US versus Europe and where you think that has been a benefit for us?
Yeah, there's a really interesting study out of the European Union a few years ago looking at Europeans' attitudes towards entrepreneurship versus having a job and comparing it a little bit to the US. And it's fascinating the outcome they found. They found that almost 60% of Europeans would prefer to have a job in an established company than start or run one. Over half of Americans feel just the opposite, would rather start and run a company than be employed by one. The number of Europeans at the time the study was done that wanted to start a company was about 35%, and the trend was downward. Where in the US, you look at that trend is probably, the study didn't say this, but anecdotally, the trend to me appears to be upward in that regard. So there's just I'm happy to let them make the choices they're making in Europe. They're just not the choices I would want to make. I think a vibrant economy that's willing to destroy something that was nice in the past but isn't part of the future and build something new for the future is an economy I like to be part of.
I'm going to build on that for both Steve and for Robert. Can you talk a little bit about what you are seeing across the country? What communities are kind of sprouting up with different or new ideas?
Well, I actually have literally seen quite a bit across the country in the last few weeks. I dropped my son off at college, and my wife and I went on a 5,500-mile road trip. And we saw 20 some odd states in about 2 weeks. And one of the things that we talked to a fair number of people, and one of the things that we kept hearing over and over again is that things are so different here than they were 3 years ago. That's true. It was true in Pittsburgh, true in Fargo, North Dakota, true in towns in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and it's a completely anecdotal, report, completely unscientific, but talking to people who've been in the same place for a few years gave me the sense that there's a lot of activity and a lot of change, a lot of development happening in many places because there's a lot of technology and cheap energy filtering into these places, and that you're seeing a revival in a lot of industries.
So there was just a Washington Post story on Monday or Tuesday, if people saw it, about the revival of blue-collar jobs in the U.S. And I think what's interesting about that, I think one of the reasons we've seen a revival of blue-collar jobs is for the first time we've seen essentially manufacturing productivity grow at the same, if not slower rate than non-manufacturing productivity growth. That's never really happened in American history before. So when we have an expansion of the economy, we're going to see more jobs in blue collar because they're not raising their productivity enough. So I think where we are in this phase, I think there's an awful lot of, our minds are ahead of reality in this space because everybody thinks, oh, man, AI, it's here. I'm going to be, the next car I get 2 years from now, it's going to drive itself, and my phone's going to be able to do all these amazing things. I don't know if you ever tried to use, some of the AI stuff, but it's, not very good. But the point is, it's going to get better, and this is to Mark's point about it. It's sort of like, I think, equivalent to cellular, sort of, maybe we're at 2.5G when we need to be at 4. I think that's where we are with this technology. Now, I'm 100% convinced that we're going to get there, and as we get there, we're going to be transforming farms. I was reading something the other day, when farmers used to have to go down their field and plow a field, fertilize a field, or seed a field, they would have to have a foot-long overlap. So they essentially seed the same thing twice or put the same fertilizer down twice. And now, because of precision farming, they have a 1-inch overlap. And we're just going to see that sort of thing. Interesting thing now, there's 170,000 farmers in the US who sell directly now to consumers. Wow. And a lot of, and by the way, interesting, the number of those are veterans. There's a higher share of women farmers now who sell directly to consumers. And that's all enabled by technology. And we're going to see that in manufacturing. We're going to see it in logistics. We're going to see it in construction. We're going to see it in a wide array of industries. And so in that sense, what's happened over the last 20 to 30 years is we've had these spots in the country where the tech industry, if you will, the tech arms dealers, have done quite well. They've done quite well on the East Coast. They've done quite well on the West Coast. That's where they're headquartered. That's where everybody is. I think what we're going to see is this movement internal into the country, if you will, because the use of this is going to be so much broader than it has been in the past.
Steve, is there anything you want to add on that?
Yes, I mean, I think I agree completely. A few weeks ago, I spoke to Thomas Tull, who was a producer in Hollywood. He'd produced 300 and The Dark Knight, and decided to have a change of career, and he moved back to Pittsburgh. And now he's investing in AI with an idea toward transforming more abundant industries. So he's doing this in medical scrubs. I don't know how he's actually applying AI to the medical scrubs business, but he says he is. But also in waste hauling, and they're using AI in one case to find excess trucking capacity. Completely changes the economics of that business, makes it a lot more efficient, probably reduces maybe some jobs in the short term and medium term, but over the long term, there's a lot of activity and growth.
Can you give a little bit of a 101 on blockchain for anybody out there that doesn't quite know the lingo and what it means?
Okay, well, blockchain is essentially what we call a distributed ledger. Explain what that means. So you think about how the banking system has worked over time. If you wanted to make a wire transfer to some other part of the world, you went through a system called the SWIFT system. There was a single point where everything would go through, and it measured, and it took time, and it's rather expensive to use. Blockchain takes that centralized system and has software that takes care of that entire function. And so when you're sending something from one bank or one individual to another in another part of the world, the blockchain just keeps track of the transaction. It says, yes, this dollar, this euro, whatever now belongs to this person over here. It's distributed in that no one controls it. It's supposed to be. It depends on who does it. The ledger spread across thousands, sometimes millions of computers around the world. And if you want to destroy that system, you have to get to all those computers. You can't simply destroy the one central computer in one place. So that's what blockchain does for it. It distributes that transaction ledger, whatever it might be, across a lot of computers. So the central work is done by the software as opposed to a group of people.
Diane, have you done any work or research or read up on these new technologies that are emerging?
I'm not an expert on the new technologies, but I can talk a little bit about what will help and what will hinder
Correct.
the new technologies. So in terms of this notion or this idea of the increasing spread inward of technological adoption and application, that is a good example of why regulation can be problematic, because as technology moves faster than government can possibly move, any rules are effectively obsolete or out of date by the time that the new technology is moving somewhere else. And so we have to be very careful, I think, about what kinds of rules that we put in place. There are ways to regulate better, and there are ways to regulate worse. And what we want to make sure that we do in cases where we do need regulation is to regulate the outcome, not the technology for getting there. Also to regulate for actual effects, that is, what are going to be the impacts and the consequences, rather than on the basis of our aspirations. And then also to devolve, as much as we can, regulation to the those who actually know, the people on the ground who actually know how technology works, how it affects local governments, and rather than there being a centralized authority here in Washington who can't really account for the vast variety that there is across the United States. And finally, that we incentivize rather than punish. And so those, I would say, are the primary points of good regulation.
Steve, I have a quick question for you, Steve. We were talking about automation and what's going on in the market and what's at work. What have you seen, and what is the current reaction, if there is one, to how it's going?
I think it varies from industry to industry. I think there's a lot of concern in areas where people's lives are obviously at stake. There's a lot of anxiety about automation when it comes to driving, although maybe not as much as we think. There's some anxiety about loss of jobs, which is legitimate because there will be a lot of loss of jobs, even if there's creation down the road. But there's also this incredible application of automation in areas that people don't know about or think about. We did a story the other day on Chevron, which is beginning to connect all of its industrial equipment at the refinery level with sensors that allow it to connect a lot of data and will allow it to automate an enormous amount of process. You're starting to see automation in the retail sector in a really big way. Prototypes of stores in which there are no people behind the cash register. We can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's happening. And you can see the same thing happening all across the grocery sector and the retail sector.
So Mark and Robert, you can't talk about automation and the job issue without talking about people and skills in the future. I would like you to talk a little bit what you've written about you can't talk about industry growth without talking about the people. And I'd love for Robert to kind of weigh in on where you think kind of the skills will be needed, what you're seeing out on that side.
Yeah. I'll talk about it outside the skills space. And it's about people changing and adapting themselves. I direct a research center at the University of Florida. Our work is going around the world and helping countries become world-class experts in their infrastructure policies. They become the experts they need rather than have a consultant come in and try to tell them what to do. One of the things we discovered early on in this work is that countries could get the economics, the law, the engineering, the account, they get all those things right, and still their systems would fall apart. And we wondered why, and we're a bunch of economists, that really confused us. What we discovered was that sometimes we were asking cultures and people to change too much too fast. So they could look at another country and say, yes, private provision of a utility service worked over there. Having people who didn't actually just bow to the prime minister worked over there, but this is our country. We're comfortable in this space. It doesn't work real well, but we're used to it. And helping people be able to let go of something that they are comfortable with and helping them see what the future should look like. That is the work of getting the people right. So we actually, a bunch of us are economists, we actually hired someone to be our director of leadership studies, who very specifically works with people saying you're in this incredibly, intensely political environment. How can you help people adapt and embrace a new future in that kind of a context where mistakes are not tolerated?
So just quickly, by the way, on the blockchain thing, we just started a series 2 weeks ago where every Monday we come out with a new 2-pager on emerging tech. So we did AI, we just did 5G on Monday, and blockchain is coming up in 2 weeks if people are interested in seeing that. So it's a really easy thing to understand these technologies. On the skills component, I 100% agree that we're going to have more disruption. Right now, actually, disruption is the lowest we've had since the Bureau of Labor Statistics has recorded it in 1995. So the odds of losing your job today through no fault of your own are the lowest they've ever been. That doesn't mean those aren't going to go back up, because they are going to go back up, and more industries and occupations are going to be disrupted by new technologies. What I worry about is that our politics is unbelievably unprepared to do that, and the reason I say that is I believe you have a bunch of folks on the left side of the aisle who say, we really don't want this, that no job loss is acceptable in the economy. It is too harmful and hurtful to people, so we're going to resist automation. We're going to resist this as much as we can because we don't want to hurt anybody. Now, the problem with that is you cannot get wage growth without productivity growth. You just cannot do it. And we've had stagnant wage growth because we haven't had strong productivity growth in a decade. On the conservative side, you hear a lot of arguments about this is some really important technology and we need to get government out of the way, which, by the way, I agree with. But if that's all we do and all these people are hurt and upset, they're going to push back politically. So we have to do a much better job of preparing people for these transitions. Good example would be right now in higher education, 32% of college seniors in their second semester are fully numerate. 39% are fully literate. College seniors, and only, 40% of people have college degrees. So we're really doing just a bad job of preparing people. And then secondly, if you lose your job in the US today from a technology dislocation, and you try to say, what are my skills? what do I need? Where should I go in terms of my career? How would I find out the skill training programs in my area? You cannot do that. And the public training system in the US has basically failed us on that. Now, there's a couple of really interesting projects that LinkedIn and Microsoft are doing in Colorado, and the big banks are doing in New York to help this. But we just have to make this better.
What are they doing specifically?
Well, you go to this thing in New York City where the big banks, along with a group called Council on Adult Experiential Learning, have created this incredible web tool. You can go on this and you can, first of all, get a skills assessment that says if you want to get into the financial services industry, these are the things that you're kind of missing. Oh, and by the way, here are the actual courses or community colleges or other things like that. Here's how to enroll in them. Click the button, you can get enrolled. And then it's also, here's how to get on the job list for these banks so that they'll hire you. Super easy, super intuitive. It's kind of like, Amazon Prime for this kind of thing. The rest of the system is like using DOS.
Right.
Can I just add
please jump
one
in.
quick point to relate what we're talking about up here to what was discussed earlier about urban areas and the lack of I think it was called the dream, what did you call it? The dream chasm or something like that. In any event, I'm from Detroit, so I can speak to this personally. And I'm a product of the Detroit public school system, but a long time ago. And so, but what I can say with certainty is that if you are a product today of the Detroit public school system, you are at a deficit educationally and in terms of workforce readiness that it's virtually impossible to make up. Basically, you come out and you can't read, can't do mathematics, don't know anything about civics. But there are some things that you would know about that are good in the political realm, but not necessarily in the academic realm. I think we have to address public education and the public education monopoly because it's clearly not working, and bring more choice, just as we want choice and competition in technology, and we see the benefits of that in technology. We need to do the same thing with education.
I want to take a quick temperature before we keep talking. Are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Can we get a microphone over here?
It's the dream divide.
Dream divide.
Dream divide. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, prefaced with I am not an economist, but I am a technologist. Can you think a little bit about what all this connectivity, ubiquitous connectivity, and AI and all these advances in technology will do to either lessen or exacerbate business cycles and the impact that has on people?
Who wants to take it?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about the turnover in the S&P 500. It's accelerated over the last few decades, and it's going to accelerate more. I don't know exactly when the complete the turnover is likely to occur, but it's going to be probably twice as fast as the last turnover. And I think, in a sense, that's kind of a business cycle of sorts. Even if the larger business cycle is moving at a different pace, the turnover within individual businesses and individual industries appears to be accelerating and relentless.
I think that one, I can't tell you if how it's going to affect the actual cycle, but I can imagine that technology will enable industry sectors to anticipate and prepare for changes in the business cycle, to adapt to it, and to recover from it. And so, in some senses, if the model continues, that is the speed up of technology in history, we may see a flattening out in some respects, or at least smaller blips in the business cycle. But that's just sort of off the top of my head.
And Diane's exactly right. The adaptation is the key. I saw a survey recently that over 60% of the big data artificial intelligence projects in major companies fail. They don't fail because they don't get the technology right, it's because the executives look at the outcome and say, I don't want to do that. And that's the human part of I'm unwilling to change. Of course, what happens in that is that another business says, I'm willing to change, and it steps into that marketplace. So arc of the business cycle per se, that's really hard to tell. The adaptation on the individual level is the key.
I just say the last two business cycle downturns have been related to sort of over-exuberance. Historically, business cycle downturns were partly, if not largely, related to inventory issues. And in theory, you should have that be much, much less. Inventory is going to be much leaner, much smarter. You're not going to produce things you don't need. I mean, as we go to 3D printing, for example, that's going to work in that direction. I would just say, I don't even think that's the most important question. I think we focus way too much on the business cycle. And how many people follow the quarterly BLS productivity releases on Friday? One person? Yeah, thank you.
We got two.
Yeah, we need to talk. The single most important statistic that the U.S. government comes out with, and reporters don't cover it, nobody covers it. And that's really what's important. If we can get U.S. productivity to grow from its sort of anemic 1.2% up to perhaps 3 or 4%, which I think is possible, that means that in a decade, our incomes are going to go up 50%. That's a huge transformation of the U.S. economy, and that is a huge transformation of sort of how we feel. Because if we all knew that our incomes were going up to 50% in 10 years, we'd all be really happy.
Are there any other questions? Yes, right here. Wait 1 second, the microphone's coming.
Hi, my name's Terry Pfeiffer, and one of the things that I do is I'm president of the federal chapter of the Government Blockchain Association, so I appreciate the shout outs for blockchain. I have a question. So and I want to string together a couple of things that you mentioned and a couple that you didn't, but there's I would say a fervent interest in blockchain just due to the market, not so much anymore, but around Bitcoin. And then some folks have talked about the migration of technology startups in particular out of the Valley, more into the Midwest. And then there's also this emerging competition between the states in terms of trying to create crypto-friendly or blockchain-friendly, or just to generalize it, technology-friendly legislation to, again, bring those companies to locate there. And then there's also this fairly recent legislation around opportunity zones. And so I'm just curious, is anyone looking at leveraging some of these different things that are happening in a way to create more exponential outcomes?
I can speak only to the part about offering abatements, be they tax abatements or other types of abatements from states and local communities, hoping to lure, companies. It sets up I don't think it's good either for states or for companies, because it sets up and sort of cements, the performance of the company, and usually they don't really work, and the cost per job created is generally huge. Companies should be going to places that are going to, help their bottom line and improve their productivity, and not be lured by, tax abatements that, don't provide much bang for the buck, so to speak.
I would chime in that entrepreneurs certainly are looking at it. I have a former student of mine out in Silicon Valley, and he invited me to come out and just kind of hang out. So my wife and I went out. Over just the 2 or 3 days they were there, we probably participated in 10 different discussions with groups of entrepreneurs saying, what can we do with blockchain? And so they're really trying to figure out what they can take this technology and do something that better than's been done before or that's never been done before. So certainly the entrepreneurs are all over it, and that's happening all over the world. But it's the clusters of those conversations. It's hard to create a cluster. It's going to be there, those like minds working together. They are paying a great deal of attention to what is being done in this town. And so some of them are indeed moving their operations overseas because they see too much regulation, whether it's in the cryptocurrency space, which they're largely using as trying to raise capital. It's not really creating the next Bitcoin, it's capital formulation. Or just how they would be regulated and how they would conduct their business. So it's not a kind of something where you would say, well, go and do whatever you can. It's to say, how do we keep the rules of the old economy from stifling what is really showing up as opportunities that could not be created with as much regulation as we have today in the traditional structures.
Well, I'll just throw one example. You know, one thing governments can do if they want to be friendly towards blockchain is they could use blockchain to transform their own operations. And you think about, for example, probably one of the least value-added things we have in the economy is title search and title insurance. When we all buy a house, are you kidding me? You have to search? And why is that? It's because governments haven't made those things with an open API. And now with blockchain, you could put all titles and then any deeds and liens and all that. It could all go on an open blockchain. And then when you buy a house, you don't have to pay that $400 or whatever it is for title search. You can just eliminate that waste from the US economy. And if governments did that, they would send a message that they are also very open to blockchain innovation.
I'm going to free ride on that comment because it also is a illustration of why we don't want government to be, that is so behind in technological adaptation to be making the decisions about what everybody else should be doing and not doing.
Any other questions? So in closing, I'd like each of you to just kind of give your prediction of what you think is really going to be the emerging big thing and the impact that we should watch for. Let's start with you.
So I start?
Yes.
Keeping in the spirit of what Diane was saying earlier about outcomes, I'm not going to focus on the outcome. I'm going to focus on my optimism for the process. I think there's a great opportunity for us to take our government system and move it, shrink it down in terms of its control so that people have greater freedom to choose. Because the path forward is very uncertain. We'll have a lot more failures than we have successes. But that process works best when people can try things like Teddy Roosevelt said about the person in the arena that dares greatly and fails. But that's the only way that you have successes, is to let the people try.
I would say that it's early and it's late enough to say with some conviction that AI will transform almost every industry that we're involved in between now and say 2030. Is that too far ahead?
That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, 2030 is good. And Diane, I'll let you just make your recommendation for what you hope for, since you're not such an industry.
Okay, well, I think I ran down some of the properties of better regulation. But there's two things that I do want to focus on. One is what worries me the most, and it's in the near term probably more than in the far into the future, is this drive to control content. And I worry that government is going to, unlike controlling smokestacks and drain pipes, effects that have, public health and safety repercussions, regulating ideas is a much more dangerous concept. And so I think we need to all be very aware of the extent to which that threat lingers.
I would say plastics. But some people haven't seen The Graduate, so yeah. Although, given that my son is finishing up a computer science degree this year and he's specializing in AI, I'm like the happiest dad in the world because I'm like, he's going to get a job. I think it's going to be AI related, but let me actually drill down one level under that. And I think it's AI-enabled autonomous systems and robotics. I just think that's going to be so transformative. It's going to be able to do so much for us. You're going to go into McDonald's and the hamburgers are going to be made by a thing. And if you want to order them, then there'll be a little robotic cart that'll come out and deliver it to you. What I find troubling is that the U.S., many countries have national R&D initiatives for robotics. We do, and we spend a massive $50 million at National Science Foundation, which is an order of magnitude less than what it should be. And what's worse is that R&D, that research that goes to university scientists, The researchers cannot use that money to build robots that replace workers. They can only use it for what are called supplemental or cobots. And I like cobots too, but I think it's a big, big mistake. I think we should just be exploring those fields and then really do a lot more to help workers. So I think that's a big deal. I look at places like San Francisco, and this is your point. San Francisco there are two main companies in the US that build these little pizza delivery robots. Have you seen these in DC? They're really cool. One of them's in San Francisco in sort of this, rundown, working class place. They employ mostly minority workers as technicians to build these things, and yet the city of San Francisco has banned sidewalk delivery robots. Because you never know, something might happen. Good.
With that, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, panelists, for your time and preparation.
Thank you.
Thank you.